Good afternoon, Spartans. Happy Friday, December 14th. Again, weekly check-in here today, 140 to 225, or by email if you haven't already done so this week. Make sure you do check in with me at least once. We're talking about causes of mass incarceration. We're picking up more or less where we left off from yesterday. Yesterday, we talked about the 20th century causes of mass incarceration. We're looking at it, the 21st century mass incarceration causes today. And then you have a reading to do with some questions to answer regarding the relation between education and crime that you need to have done for Tuesday next week. Well, let's start with our discussion questions from yesterday. All right, let's look at these. Zoom in here. Question number one: what was the government's solution to combat increasing crime rates in the 20th century? How did the government try to deter crime? Again, pretty well laid out in the video. War on crime, war on drugs. We have these huge problems. Their solution was to go to war, right? To lock these people up. It was all about getting these people off the street, send them to prison. That will solve our problem. But it didn't solve the problem. We sent more and more and more people to jail for the same crimes. And then we started increasing the punishment for those crimes because apparently we thought that the punishment wasn't enough. The punishment we had wasn't severe enough. So we tried increasing the punishments and mandatory minimums and life in prison. 3 strikes, you're out. Just led to more people going to jail, and it still didn't answer the problem. 2, 13th talked about imagery and messaging in campaigns and on newscasts as one of the causes of America's mass incarceration. Is the messaging and imagery in American campaigns and on newscasts the same or different today? Explain. This is an opinion question. I don't know if it necessarily is. I don't know if it has changed. I mean, you look at Minneapolis, specifically in the state of Minnesota, you look at all of the riots and the increase in crime that is occurring in Minneapolis since May of 2020. I don't know if you can argue that times have changed. I mean, Governor Walz and Mayor Tim Fry of Minneapolis, I mean, they're going to have a tough re-election go because of what has happened. And I think, they're both Democrats. You've got Republicans who are going to make an argument that the city is less safe, the state is less safe. We've got these criminals, thugs running around society, doing what they wish. You have an increase in auto thefts on Kia and Hyundai cars. You have an increase in catalytic converter thefts, not to mention other violent crime. I don't know if it's any different. President Trump, right? His campaign is very much talking about crime, right? He said in multiple campaign stumps, I am the law and order candidate. I don't know if the messaging has changed. The problems might be a little bit different, right? It's not cocaine and crack anymore. It's opioids and fentanyl. The groups of people who, might be marginalized might have changed, but I don't know if necessarily the messaging is different. But again, you guys might have a different opinion than I do. 3, 13th heavily criticized the American judicial system for its complacency and systemic racism and prejudice and the government's quote-unquote solutions to combat crime rates during the 20th century. But what did it fail to answer or explain in regards to criminal or deviant behavior? Nothing drives me more nuts than people who want to sit around and complain about something, but never offer a solution, that don't bring anything to the table about how to make something better. And that's probably what my biggest criticism of this film. It does nothing to address the problem. They make no offer of any potential solution to solve our mass incarceration, to solve violent crime, to solve drug issues, drug abuse, drug addiction. They do none of it. They just simply say, this is a problem, this is unfair. They complain about it, not saying they're not unjustified in their complaints, but they offer no solution. Why don't they offer a solution? Because the solution is probably the hardest part. It's easy to point out where someone has made a mistake. It's easy to point out someone's flaws. It's easy to point out what the problem with something is. But it takes a truly intelligent person to come up with a better idea, because that opens them up to criticism. It opens them up to pushback, and they don't do it, which is really unfortunate. We're going to look at now some potential solutions this week. But again, we got to look at mass incarceration from a 21st century perspective. We've covered the societal problems, the inequity that existed in the 20th century, in the 1900s, as to why certain groups of people were more or less targeted for criminality and punishment. But those don't necessarily apply today. They're not as big of a cause. Does prejudice and racism, bigotry still play an impact? I mean, I'd be an idiot if I said no, it doesn't play any impact. I'm certainly there is, to an extent. But there's been a significant change to our laws in recent years, but we still have this incarceration problem. If we look at drugs, like, we're changing the laws, the consequences for people who break drug laws, right? Marijuana is now being legalized in states all over the country. People who are sentenced to prison for drug crimes are having their sentences reduced unless there was an additional component to the crime, such as it being violent, if there was a gun involved, if there was a weapon involved. We're reducing sentences, but we still have a huge prison population. Probably one of the biggest problems with our incarceration in this century is this concept of de facto segregation and something called disparate impact. Now, here's the thing. De facto segregation, we know what segregation is. I pray that you guys know what segregation is, right? Separating people for one reason or the other. You could separate people on race, you could separate people on religion, you could separate people on gender. For a very long time, this country used to practice something called de jure segregation, which doesn't exist anymore. That's been found to be unconstitutional in Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. But we very much have de facto segregation. And de facto segregation, I mean, it's Latin de facto, matter of fact, just happens, is literally what it means. Segregation that just happens. We segregate ourselves. Think about this in elementary school and middle school. I would imagine when you went to lunch, you sat with your friends. And at middle school and lunch, at those grade levels, I'm pretty sure if you were a girl, you sat with girls. And if you were a boy, you sat with boys. And at the high school, I would imagine you sit with your friends. And there's a pretty good chance that your friends are going to be different than the other people sitting at different tables. Maybe you sit with your friends because you're on the same team. Maybe you sit with your friends who are in the same club. Maybe you sit with friends who are in the band or in the choir, or you're, big art nerds or math nerds or whatever. People more or less congregate with other people that they can identify with. And the same is true in the world, in real life. For a long time, I mean, Americans live, if you were black, you lived in a black community. If you were white, you lived in a white community. If you're Latino, you lived in a Latino community. If you're Asian, you lived in an Asian community. It happens. There's no law enforcing it later on in the 20th century. There's no law requiring it. You just did it. You lived with people that you identified with. I would imagine it gave you some sort of comfort, some sort of connection, some sort of belonging. It just happens, though. And if you were to look at Inver Grove Heights, I would imagine beyond race, there's socioeconomic de facto segregation that just occurs naturally. I would imagine in Inver Grove Heights, there's neighborhoods that are wealthy. And in Inver Grove Heights, there are neighborhoods that are poor. And I would imagine you wouldn't find an affluent person living in a poor or middle income neighborhood or a lower income neighborhood. And I would imagine there aren't poor or lower income Inver Grove Heights citizens living in the wealthier neighborhoods. People separate. People find where they fit in society. And how this plays into the mass incarceration is this concept of disparate impact. And this is something that, our country is continuously looking at. We pass laws that are We pass laws, we enforce laws, we create laws that don't have an equal treatment for all people. We do something, we pass a law because we think it's best, it's beneficial. It has one impact for one group of people, and it has a completely different impact for another. These are some of the causes of why we have so many. This is one of the causes, one of the major causes of why we have such a high incarceration rate, even after we've, more or less moved away and are continuing to make gains and moving away from Jim Crow, from codified, prejudicial, and racist laws. Still exists today. We have another problem in the 21st century, and that's our criminal justice system. I mean, you guys know I do some legal work on this side. I mean, lawyers are charging $1,000, $5,000 an hour. So if you're a person who has committed a crime, it is going to cost you a significant amount of money to defend yourself, to minimize the consequence that you can have. $5,000 an hour, $1,000, even $500 an hour. This is a significant amount of time. I mean, I think of the legal cases that I have to write for lawsuits. I mean, it probably takes me, I don't know, maybe 4 hours at $500 an hour. That's $2,000. Not a lot of people have that money just sitting around, which is probably one of the biggest criticisms of our judicial system. If you got to pay for a lawyer, you got to have money. And if you can't pay for a lawyer, then you get a public defender who, undoubtedly is going to try to do their best, but there's a lot of people that can't afford to pay for a lawyer, which means that public defender, that government attorney who's paid to represent you, has about 1,000 other people that he or she is working with as well. And they don't have time to put up a good defense, which is what the video was getting at. They were talking about plea bargaining. Something like 95%, 90% of people who go to jail have accepted a plea bargain, even if they were innocent. You get charged with the crime. The punishment for that crime is, let's say, 10 years behind bars, 10 years in prison. But the government will offer you a plea deal to keep things moving so that the judicial system's not bogged down. If you plead guilty to a crime, we'll give you 3 years in prison instead of 10. So you're a person sitting there thinking, well, I can't afford a lawyer at $1,000 an hour, so I can go to jail for 3 years and get out and still be able to function and live in society. Or I can go to jail for 10 years. I can go to jail for a decade. Oh, God. And again, it doesn't even matter if the person's guilty or not. Can you pay for a lawyer? And if you can't pay for a lawyer, are you going to run the risk of going to jail for 3 times longer than just pleading and saying you're guilty when you're not? The financial inequities of our judicial system very much play into the disparate impact of laws. Different groups of people get treated differently. And it has very little to do with where people are coming from, and it has very little to do with people's skin color. A lot of this has to do with the de facto segregation that exists. Okay. All right. De jure segregation, that is something that this country had. And are we completely over, and have we completely rectified that problem? Many would argue no. Jim Crow is de facto segregation. It was law. It was written. Whites, blacks, separated. Not the case anymore. We still have this de facto segregation. The segregation of people naturally. This is having a huge impact. Because again, if you're one of those people in a poor neighborhood, you're going to have a completely different experience in this country than if you're living in a wealthier neighborhood. And this again is what we're talking about with that whole disparate impact. You can have a law written that is neutral, that is not prejudicial, is not sexist, is not misogynist, is not xenophobic, is not racist, and it can still have a completely different impact on different groups of people. Think about this. Here's an example. States are passing laws that require a person to have a driver's license to vote. You cannot vote without a driver's license. Makes no mention of socioeconomic status, makes no mention of race, makes no mention of gender, makes no mention of anything. It's neutral. Driver's license to vote. but that can still have an impact on different groups of people. Driver's license costs money. People who have driver's license typically have a car, which has money. People who have driver's license typically don't live in gigantic cities. Think like New York City. Not everyone has a car there. And then we think about people who, people who do have money and people who don't have money. Statistically speaking, most affluent people, wealthy people in this country are going to be white, educated. So white people, educated, affluent people are going to have a completely different experience with this law than people who are a minority, poor, less educated, don't have a car. That's what we're talking about, disparate impact. But if we're talking about, criminality and deviant behavior, I can guarantee you as a result of de facto segregation, any poor community is going to have a different experience with any law regarding criminality than a wealthier community. And if we're just talking about straight up socioeconomic status, there's no preclusion there for race. I mean, there are plenty of affluent minorities, and there are plenty of poor whites. But again, the treatment is still different. If you're living in a poor community, let's look at this little information here. If you're living in a more impoverished community, a lower income community, if you're poor, you are twice as likely, you are more than twice as likely to commit a violent crime, to commit a crime compared to a higher income community. Compare like Stillwater to North Minneapolis. There's all sorts of different people that live in North Minneapolis, and there's all sorts of different people that live in Stillwater. But from a socioeconomic standpoint, I can guarantee you there's going to be less crime in Stillwater and there's going to be more crime in North Minneapolis. And those people are going to have a completely different experience regarding the laws. You're going to see more people punished for things they either did or didn't do than you're going to see in Stillwater. And I'm telling you right now, there's still crimes that occur in Stillwater. But the treatment is different. It's not just about race here in the 21st century. There are some major problems that we still have in this country, right? Our judicial system is expensive. Not everyone can afford that. Wealthy versus poor, disparate impact. A wealthy person, Donald Trump is having a completely different experience in the American judicial system than me. If I were to do the same things that Donald Trump did, I probably would have had to plea bargain. I probably would have had to admit guilt even if I didn't do it because I can't afford the lawyers for that. Or you look at January 6th, Donald Trump is on trial for January 6th. Many of the people that were a part of January 6th at the Capitol, they've already been convicted. They've either plead, accepted their punishment, tried to defend themselves the best they could, but at the end, they're running out of money. There is some inequity in our country. Not so much race anymore. Not so much national origin anymore. Does it play a part? No question. But now we're talking about the difference in wealth. And in this particular case, when we're talking about locking people up, the poor are suffering more than the wealthy. And it's the wealthy who are benefiting from this criminal industrial complex. Politicians are wealthy. They benefit. They get reelected by saying they're cleaning up the street. Corporations are benefiting because they're selling their product to prisons. While the average American, the lower income American, is left more or less defenseless. And again, a lot of this comes from where we live, the community that we live in. And again, it has less to do with race and more to do with socioeconomic status. In this case, the lower income, poor Americans live where they live, and the wealthier, more affluent live where they live. And they experience this law, experience any laws, experience criminality in completely different ways. We're going to start looking at attempting to solve the mass incarceration problem. We're going to try to offer better solutions to the prison industrial complex. So the first thing we're going to look at here is a reading and some questions on crime and education. Does education reduce? Does education prevent crime from happening. So you've got some questions here, 9 or 14 questions. I can't remember. The article is linked within the actual questions. All right. So you need to have that done by Tuesday next week, and we'll start talking about education, society, and crime. You guys have a great weekend. Do make sure to check in with me if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next week. Go Spartans.